The fluorescent lights of Walter Reed National Military Medical Center hummed their familiar tune as Captain Sarah Mitchell adjusted her stethoscope and checked the time. 11:47 p.m. Another night shift was beginning, and to anyone watching, she was the epitome of dedication. A decorated Army nurse who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, now caring for wounded warriors on home soil. But beneath her pristine white uniform and compassionate smile lay secrets that would soon shake the very foundations of military medical care. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Captain Mitchell moved through the corridors with practiced efficiency, her soft-soled shoes making barely a whisper against the polished linoleum. Ward 7 East was her domain during these dark hours, home to soldiers recovering from combat injuries, men and women who had sacrificed everything for their country and now trusted her with their lives. She paused at the nurse's station, reviewing patient charts with the kind of meticulous attention that had earned her commendations from commanding officers and grateful families alike. "Evening, Captain," whispered Corpsman Jenkins, a young medic who had just returned from deployment in Syria. His left leg bore the scars of an IED blast, and he was scheduled for another surgery in the morning. "Pain's acting up again. Think I could get something for it?" Sarah's smile was warm, maternal almost. "Of course, soldier. Let me check your chart." Her fingers danced across the computer keyboard with practiced precision, accessing his medical records. What Jenkins couldn't see was the subtle way she modified his medication dosage, increasing it just enough to ensure he would sleep deeply, too deeply to notice the small injection site that would appear on his arm before dawn. This wasn't random cruelty. Captain Mitchell's actions were part of something much larger, something that had been festering within the military medical system for months. She had been recruited not by enemy agents or terrorist organizations, but by a shadow network of defense contractors who had found a way to profit from the very soldiers they claimed to support. The scheme was diabolically simple, yet devastatingly effective. Wounded soldiers, particularly those with severe injuries or PTSD, were being used as unwitting test subjects for experimental drugs and medical devices. These weren't approved treatments, they were prototype pharmaceuticals and experimental procedures that defense contractors needed to test before presenting them to the Pentagon for lucrative military contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Captain Mitchell had initially resisted when she was first approached 18 months ago. Dr. Marcus Webb, a civilian contractor working for Titan Medical Solutions, had presented the opportunity as patriotic duty. "Think of it as helping advance military medicine," he had said during their clandestine meeting in a downtown DC hotel. "These soldiers are going to benefit from breakthrough treatments that could save thousands of lives in future conflicts." But the real motivation was money, lots of it. Each soldier enrolled in their unofficial trials generated $50,000 in payments to participating medical personnel. For a nurse supporting 2 children after a messy divorce, the financial incentive proved impossible to resist. What she told herself was that she was helping advance medical science while securing her family's future. What she refused to acknowledge was that she was violating every oath she had taken as both a soldier and a medical professional. The network operated with military precision. Dr. Webb had recruited nurses, doctors, and technicians across multiple military medical facilities. Walter Reed was just one node in a web that stretched from Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany to military hospitals in San Antonio, San Diego, and Norfolk. Each facility had its own Captain Mitchell, trusted medical professionals who used their access and authority to conduct unauthorized human experiments. The selection criteria for test subjects were coldly calculated. Soldiers with severe injuries who were on strong pain medications were ideal because any side effects could be attributed to their existing conditions. Those with PTSD were particularly valuable because psychological symptoms from experimental drugs would likely be dismissed as part of their existing mental health struggles. Most importantly, they targeted soldiers who had limited family contact or support systems, men and women whose sudden deterioration or unexpected complications would generate fewer questions. As Captain Mitchell prepared the evening medications for her patients, she reflected on how seamlessly the operation had integrated into routine medical care. The experimental drugs were disguised as standard pain medications or antibiotics. The extra blood draws were documented as routine monitoring. The extra imaging studies were justified as necessary follow-ups. To any outside observer, everything appeared normal and medically appropriate. But tonight would be different. Tonight, Captain Mitchell had no idea that her carefully constructed world was about to collapse. 3 floors below, in a secure conference room, a joint task force of military investigators, FBI agents, and DEA officials was reviewing months of surveillance footage, financial records, and testimony from a whistleblower whose conscience had finally overcome their fear. The investigation had begun 6 months earlier when Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, a combat medic recovering from injuries sustained in Iraq, had noticed something disturbing. Soldiers under her care were experiencing unusual side effects and complications that didn't match their documented treatments. When she tried to report her concerns through proper channels, she was reassigned and warned to focus on her own recovery. But Rodriguez was a soldier first, and she couldn't ignore what she was seeing. She began documenting everything, taking photos of medication labels, recording unusual symptoms, and tracking which personnel were involved in caring for affected patients. When she finally contacted the FBI, she brought with her evidence of a conspiracy that reached far beyond what anyone had imagined. Special Agent Diana Foster of the FBI's Washington Field Office had seen plenty of corruption cases during her 15-year career, but the evidence spread across her desk represented something uniquely sinister. Medical records, financial transactions, and encrypted communications painted a picture of systematic abuse that made her stomach turn. The scope of the operation was staggering. At least 47 soldiers across 6 military medical facilities had been subjected to unauthorized medical experiments, and those were just the cases they had identified so far. "This is bigger than we initially thought," Agent Foster said, addressing the joint task force assembled in the secure briefing room at FBI headquarters. The team included representatives from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, the Army Criminal Investigative Command, and the Department of Veterans Affairs Inspector General's office. "We're not dealing with a few rogue medical professionals. This is an organized criminal enterprise with connections to major defense contractors." The investigation had taken on new urgency 3 weeks earlier when Private First Class David Kim, a 22-year-old soldier recovering from blast injuries, had suffered a massive cardiac event that left him in a coma. His medical team was baffled. Kim was young, athletic, and had no history of heart problems. But when investigators analyzed his blood work, they found traces of an experimental cardiac stimulant that wasn't approved for human use. The drug was being developed by Titan Medical Solutions under a classified Pentagon research contract. Colonel James Harrison, the Army's representative on the task force, leaned forward in his chair. "We've identified the key players in what they're calling Project Nightingale. Captain Sarah Mitchell is our primary target at Walter Reed, but we know she's not operating alone. Our surveillance suggests she's part of a cell that includes at least 3 other nurses and 2 physicians." The evidence against Captain Mitchell was overwhelming. Financial records showed regular deposits to an offshore account totaling over $400,000 in the past 18 months. Encrypted messages between her and Dr. Webb detailed specific soldiers who were enrolled in various studies. Most damning of all, surveillance cameras had captured her administering unmarked injections to patients on night shifts when oversight was minimal. Agent Foster pulled up surveillance footage on the large screen at the front of the room. The video showed Captain Mitchell in Ward 7 East approaching the bed of a sleeping soldier. She glanced around carefully before producing a small syringe from her pocket and injecting its contents into the patient's IV line. The soldier never woke up.
He had been heavily sedated as part of the unauthorized experiment. This particular incident occurred 12 days ago, Foster explained. The patient, Sergeant Michael Torres, was being treated for shrapnel wounds from an IED explosion in Afghanistan. According to his official medical records, he should have received standard pain medication and antibiotics. Instead, our lab analysis shows he was given an experimental nerve regeneration drug that hadn't even completed animal trials. The psychological profiles of the conspirators revealed a troubling pattern. Most were experienced medical professionals who had served with distinction in combat zones. They weren't motivated by ideology or foreign influence. They were driven by financial desperation, career ambition, or misguided belief that they were advancing military medicine. Dr. Webb had been particularly skilled at exploiting these vulnerabilities, presenting the scheme as both profitable and patriotic. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Brennan from Army Medical Command shook her head in disgust. These soldiers trusted us with their lives. They believed they were receiving the best possible care. Instead, they were being treated like laboratory rats. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Some of these men and women will never fully recover from injuries they sustained serving our country. To victimize them further is unconscionable. The investigation had revealed that Titan Medical Solutions was not acting alone. They had partnerships with at least 3 other defense contractors, each developing different types of experimental treatments for potential military applications. The soldiers at Walter Reed and other facilities were being used to generate preliminary safety and efficacy data that would be crucial for securing military contracts worth billions of dollars. Agent Foster clicked to the next slide, showing a complex organizational chart. The network operates like a multi-level marketing scheme for human experimentation. Dr. Webb recruits medical professionals at military facilities, providing them with experimental drugs and detailed protocols. The medical staff receives payment for each patient enrolled and additional bonuses for detailed data collection. Titan and its partners get preliminary human trial data at a fraction of the cost of legitimate clinical trials. The scope of the conspiracy extended beyond medical experiments. Investigators had uncovered evidence of systematic medical fraud, with inflated billing to military health insurance programs generating additional profits. Some soldiers were kept in the hospital longer than medically necessary to provide more opportunities for experimentation. Others received unnecessary procedures to test experimental surgical techniques and devices. Master Sergeant Tony Ramirez, a combat veteran serving as the enlisted representative on the task force, slammed his hand on the table. These bastards are stealing from the taxpayers and torturing soldiers at the same time. We need to move fast before more good people get hurt. The timeline for action was accelerating. Intelligence suggested that Dr. Webb was planning to expand operations to additional military medical facilities, including overseas hospitals treating soldiers in active combat zones. The potential for devastating harm to service members was enormous, and the task force leadership knew they couldn't wait for a perfect case to be built. "We're moving to the operational phase," Agent Foster announced. "We have enough evidence for arrests and search warrants. Colonel Harrison, I need your people to coordinate with Walter Reed Security to ensure we can execute simultaneously across all targeted facilities." The plan was ambitious and complex. Coordinated raids would take place at military hospitals in 5 states, targeting 17 medical professionals and 3 defense contractor offices. The operation would require precise timing to prevent evidence destruction and ensure that ongoing experiments could be immediately halted to prevent further harm to patients.
The pre-dawn hours of November 15th marked the beginning of the end for Project Nightingale. In a secure staging area 5 miles from Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, federal agents and military personnel made final preparations for what would become one of the largest healthcare fraud raids in military history. Special Agent Foster checked her watch, 3:47 a.m. In less than 2 hours, coordinated operations would commence across 6 military medical facilities simultaneously. The tactical briefing had been thorough and sobering. Intelligence indicated that the conspirators had become increasingly paranoid in recent weeks, suggesting they might be aware that their activities were under investigation. Dr. Webb had reportedly been destroying documents and had attempted to relocate several key experiments to overseas facilities where oversight would be even more limited. Time was running out. "Remember, our primary concern is patient safety," Agent Foster addressed the assembled team of FBI agents, military investigators, and SWAT officers. "We have credible intelligence that at least 12 soldiers are currently receiving experimental treatments. Our medical team needs immediate access to those patients to assess their condition and reverse any harmful effects."
Captain Mitchell had no idea that her every move was being monitored. Hidden cameras in Ward 7 East captured her routine as she began what would be her final night shift. She appeared calm and professional, checking on patients with her usual attention to detail. But investigators knew that tonight's schedule included the administration of a particularly dangerous experimental compound to 3 soldiers, a prototype pain medication that had caused fatal cardiac complications in laboratory animals. The surveillance team watched as Mitchell prepared the evening medications in the hospital pharmacy. Her movements were practiced and efficient, but they also captured her substituting standard medications with unmarked vials retrieved from a locked refrigerator that didn't appear on any hospital inventory. Each substitution was photographed and documented, providing the final pieces of evidence needed to ensure successful prosecution. Dr. Webb had arrived at Walter Reed earlier than usual that evening, ostensibly to check on a research project, but investigators knew his real purpose was to personally oversee the administration of what he called Phase 3 protocols to selected patients. These were the most aggressive experimental treatments yet, involving drugs that hadn't even completed basic safety testing. The potential for serious harm or death was significant. The coordination between agencies was unprecedented. At exactly 5:30 a.m., teams would simultaneously breach facilities in Maryland, Virginia, Texas, California, and Germany. Each team had specific targets and objectives, but all were working toward the same goal: shutting down Project Nightingale and protecting the soldiers who had been victimized by those they trusted most. Colonel Harrison monitored communications from the FBI Command Center. Eagle 1, this is Command. Status report on primary target. The response was immediate. Command, Eagle 1. Target is on station and beginning evening protocols. Medical team standing by to assess affected patients. The medical team was crucial to the operation's success. Led by Dr. Patricia Santos, a military physician specializing in toxicology, they were prepared to immediately evaluate and treat soldiers who might be experiencing adverse effects from experimental drugs. Several patients had been identified as high priority based on their recent medical history and potential exposure to dangerous compounds. Inside Ward 7 East, Captain Mitchell approached the bed of Corporal Jason Mueller, a 25-year-old Marine who'd lost his left arm to an improvised explosive device in Syria. Mueller was scheduled to receive what his chart indicated was a routine antibiotic injection. In reality, Mitchell was about to administer an experimental nerve regeneration compound that had caused permanent neurological damage in previous test subjects. "How are you feeling tonight, Corporal?" Mitchell asked, her voice carrying the same compassionate tone that had earned the trust of countless soldiers and their families. Mueller, groggy from pain medication, managed a weak smile. "Better, ma'am. Thanks for taking such good care of me." The irony was devastating. Mitchell had genuinely cared for these soldiers initially, but financial desperation and gradual moral compromise had transformed her into something unrecognizable. Each injection she administered pushed her further from the healer she had once been towards something far more sinister. Dr. Webb watched from the hallway as Mitchell prepared the injection. His phone buzzed with an encrypted message. "Expedite current protocols. Situation may be compromised." The warning had come too late. Federal agents were already in position throughout the hospital, and SWAT teams were preparing to breach entrances simultaneously. At 5:29 a.m., Agent Foster received final confirmation from all teams. All units, this is Command. Execute, execute, execute." The words that had been rehearsed dozens of times were finally spoken in earnest. The first sign that something was wrong was when Captain Mitchell noticed unusual activity in the hospital corridors. Security guards who weren't part of the regular staff were taking positions at elevator banks and stairwells. Her years of military training kicked in, and she immediately recognized the signs of a coordinated tactical operation. Dr. Webb's instincts were even sharper. The moment he saw the first federal agent enter the hospital's main lobby, he knew Project Nightingale had been exposed. His first thought was evidence destruction, financial records, patient files, and drug samples that could link him and his associates to months of illegal human experimentation. But it was too late for damage control. SWAT officers breached the pharmaceutical storage areas simultaneously, securing all experimental drugs and documentation before anyone could destroy evidence. Military police took control of all computer systems, ensuring that electronic records would be preserved for prosecution. The carefully orchestrated criminal enterprise that had victimized dozens of wounded soldiers was about to face the full weight of military and federal justice. The night shift was ending, but for Captain Mitchell and her co-conspirators, a much longer and more difficult ordeal was just beginning.
At precisely 5:30 a.m., the silence of Walter Reed National Military Medical Center shattered like glass. SWAT teams breached multiple entrances simultaneously, their tactical boots echoing through corridors that moments before had been filled only with the soft sounds of healing. The coordinated operation unfolded with military precision, which was fitting given that many of the federal agents executing the raid were military veterans themselves. Captain Mitchell felt her blood turn cold as tactical officers flooded into Ward 7 East. She was still holding the syringe containing the experimental nerve compound intended for Corporal Mueller, her hand frozen mid-injection. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, she stared at the tactical team leader, recognizing in his eyes the same determination she had once carried into combat zones in Afghanistan. "Federal agents, nobody move!" The command echoed through the ward as patients who had been sleeping peacefully suddenly found themselves in the middle of what appeared to be a war zone. The irony wasn't lost on the wounded soldiers. They had survived combat overseas only to witness a tactical operation in what should have been their safe haven of recovery. Corporal Mueller, despite his pain medication, immediately recognized the sounds and movements of a coordinated military operation. His Marine training kicked in and he tried to sit up in bed. "What's happening, Captain?" he asked Mitchell, but she couldn't respond. She was still holding the syringe containing the experimental nerve compound intended for Corporal Mueller, her hand frozen mid-injection. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, she stared at the tactical team leader, recognizing in his eyes the same determination she had once carried into combat zones in Afghanistan. "Federal agents, nobody move!" The command echoed through the ward as patients who had been sleeping peacefully suddenly found themselves in the middle of what appeared to be a war zone. The irony wasn't lost on the wounded soldiers who had survived combat overseas, only to witness a tactical operation in what should have been their safe haven of recovery. Corporal Mueller, despite his pain medication, immediately recognized the sounds and movements of a coordinated military operation. His Marine training kicked in, and he tried to sit up in bed. "What's happening, Captain?" he asked Mitchell, but she couldn't respond. She was still holding the syringe in her hand as if seeing it clearly for the first time. Special Agent Foster approached Mitchell with deliberate calm, her weapon drawn but not aimed directly at the nurse. "Captain Sarah Mitchell, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud, aggravated assault on military personnel, and violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Place the syringe on the bedside table and step away from the patient." The transformation in Mitchell's demeanor was striking. The compassionate nurse who had comforted wounded soldiers for months suddenly looked older, smaller, and utterly defeated. Her military bearing crumbled as she realized the magnitude of what she had done, not just to her career or her freedom, but to the soldiers who had trusted her with their lives. "I never meant for anyone to get seriously hurt," Mitchell said, her voice barely above a whisper as she placed the syringe down with trembling hands. "Dr. Webb said we were advancing military medicine. He said these treatments would help thousands of soldiers in future conflicts." Dr. Patricia Santos, the military toxicologist leading the medical response team, immediately moved to Corporal Mueller's bedside. "Corporal, I'm Dr. Santos. We need to run some tests to make sure you haven't been given anything that could harm you. You're safe now." Her calm professionalism helped stabilize what could have been a chaotic situation as other patients throughout the ward began to understand they were witnessing arrests, not an attack. 3 floors down,
Dr. Webb was attempting to destroy evidence with increasing desperation. He had barricaded himself in a small office adjacent to the hospital's research laboratory, frantically deleting files from his laptop while burning paper documents in a metal wastebasket. The smoke triggered fire alarms, which only accelerated the timeline for the tactical teams trying to reach him. Dr. Marcus Webb, this is the FBI. You are surrounded. Exit the office immediately with your hands visible. The megaphone announcement echoed through the research wing. As SWAT officers positioned themselves outside the only exit from his improvised fortress, Webb's response was to dump hard drives into a sink and pour acid over them, destroying data that could have helped investigators understand the full scope of Project Nightingale. But his desperate attempts at evidence destruction were largely futile. The FBI had been monitoring his electronic communications for weeks and had already secured copies of most crucial files. Back in Ward 7 East, the medical response team worked swiftly to assess patients who might have been subjects of unauthorized experiments. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the whistleblower who had triggered the investigation, arrived to help identify soldiers who had exhibited unusual symptoms or received suspicious treatments. "That's Private Kim," Rodriguez pointed toward a young soldier sleeping heavily in bed 3. "He's been on the ward for 6 weeks with injuries that should have healed by now. His recovery has been unusually slow, and he's complained of symptoms that don't match his documented treatments." Dr. Santos immediately ordered comprehensive blood work and toxicology screens for 12 patients identified as potential victims. The medical evaluation was complicated by the fact that many soldiers were receiving legitimate pain medications and treatments that could mask or complicate the effects of experimental drugs.
The interrogation rooms at FBI headquarters buzzed with activity as investigators began the complex process of unraveling Project Nightingale's full scope. Captain Mitchell sat across from Agent Foster, her military posture replaced by the slumped shoulders of someone whose world had completely collapsed. The recording equipment captured every word as one of the military's most trusted medical professionals began revealing secrets that would shock the defense establishment. "It started small," Mitchell began, her voice hollow with exhaustion and regret. "Dr. Webb approached me at a medical conference in Chicago 18 months ago. He said Titan Medical Solutions was developing breakthrough treatments for combat injuries, but they needed experienced military nurses to help with preliminary safety assessments." Agent Foster leaned forward, maintaining steady eye contact. "These weren't safety assessments, Captain. These were unauthorized human experiments on wounded soldiers. You administered drugs that hadn't completed animal trials to men and women who trusted you with their lives." The financial records painted a clear picture of Mitchell's motivation. Her ex-husband's failure to pay child support, combined with mounting medical bills for her daughter's chronic illness, had created desperate circumstances. When Dr. Webb offered $50,000 per enrolled patient, the money seemed like a lifeline rather than blood money. "I told myself I was helping advance military medicine," Mitchell continued, tears streaming down her face. "These soldiers were going to benefit from breakthrough treatments. At least, that's what I needed to believe to sleep at night." The psychological manipulation employed by the conspiracy's leadership was sophisticated and deliberate. Dr. Webb had specifically targeted military medical professionals who were facing financial hardship, family crises, or career setbacks. He presented the illegal experiments as patriotic duty, framing participation as service to future generations of soldiers. In another interrogation room, Dr. Webb was proving far less cooperative. Despite overwhelming evidence of his leadership role in Project Nightingale, he maintained that his work was legitimate medical research conducted with proper oversight and approval. His lawyer had advised him to remain silent, but Webb's arrogance made it impossible for him to resist defending what he saw as groundbreaking scientific work. "You people don't understand the bigger picture," Webb told Agent Foster during his initial interrogation. "Military medicine advances through bold research. Every major medical breakthrough required someone willing to take calculated risks. The soldiers we worked with received cutting-edge treatments that could save thousands of lives." Agent Foster placed photographs of hospitalized soldiers on the table between them. Private First Class Kim is in a coma because of your cutting-edge treatment. Staff Sergeant Williams suffered permanent kidney damage from your experimental pain medication. Corporal Jackson attempted suicide after psychological side effects from your PTSD drugs. These aren't calculated risks. They're criminal acts. The investigation revealed that Titan Medical Solutions had been operating Project Nightingale as part of a broader strategy to secure lucrative military contracts. By conducting unauthorized human trials, they could present preliminary safety and efficacy data to Pentagon procurement officials, giving them significant advantages over competitors who relied on traditional clinical trial processes. Financial analysis showed that the conspiracy had generated over $47 million in fraudulent billings to military health insurance programs while conducting experiments that should have cost legitimate pharmaceutical companies hundreds of millions of dollars in properly supervised clinical trials. The soldiers weren't just victims of medical abuse, they were also unwitting participants in massive fraud against taxpayers. Master Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, a combat medic who had worked alongside Mitchell at Walter Reed, struggled to comprehend how her trusted colleague had become involved in such a scheme. Sarah was one of the best nurses I ever served with, Walsh told investigators. She saved lives in Afghanistan, worked double shifts to care for wounded soldiers, and always put patient welfare first. I can't understand how she became capable of this. The answer lay in the gradual nature of Mitchell's corruption. Dr. Webb hadn't approached her with a proposal for large-scale human experimentation. Instead, he had started with requests for minor protocol modifications and additional blood draws, gradually escalating to more serious violations as Mitchell became financially dependent on the illegal payments. Psychological profiles of the conspirators revealed a pattern of moral injury that was tragically common among military personnel. Many had witnessed horrific injuries and death during combat deployments, leading to a gradual desensitization to human suffering. Dr. Webb had exploited the psychological vulnerability, presenting the experiments as acceptable casualties in a larger war against injury and disease. The impact on military families was devastating. Spouses and parents of victimized soldiers had trusted the military medical system to provide the best possible care for their loved ones. Instead, their family members had been subjected to dangerous experiments that prolonged recovery times and, in some cases, caused permanent harm. Lisa Mueller, wife of Corporal Jason Mueller, spoke to investigators through tears. Jason trusted Captain Mitchell completely. When he was in pain, when he couldn't sleep, when he was scared about his recovery, she was always there to comfort him. To learn that she was secretly experimenting on him, it's destroyed his faith in everyone and everything. The legal implications were staggering. Federal prosecutors were preparing charges that could result in life sentences for the primary conspirators. Military prosecutors were simultaneously developing court-martial proceedings that would strip convicted personnel of rank, benefits, and honor. The cases would likely take years to fully prosecute, given the complexity of evidence and number of victims involved. But beyond the criminal proceedings, the scandal was forcing a complete reevaluation of oversight and security within military medical facilities. How had such an extensive conspiracy operated undetected for over 18 months? What systemic failures had allowed defense contractors to gain such influence over military medical personnel? The answers would require painful soul-searching within institutions that prided themselves on honor, integrity, and service. The psychiatric ward at Walter Reed had become an unexpected focal point of the investigation as the full psychological impact of Project Nightingale began to emerge. Soldiers who had been unknowing subjects of medical experiments were experiencing a unique form of trauma, betrayal by the very people they had trusted with their recovery and their lives. The psychological wounds were proving as devastating as the physical harm caused by unauthorized treatments. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres sat in his hospital bed, staring at the IV port in his arm, where Captain Mitchell had administered an experimental nerve regeneration drug just days before the raids. The drug had caused severe neurological complications, leaving him with tremors and memory problems that doctors weren't sure would ever fully resolve. But the physical symptoms paled in comparison to the psychological devastation.
I can't trust anyone anymore, Torres told Dr. Rebecca Chen, the military psychiatrist assigned to work with Project Nightingale victims. If Captain Mitchell could do this to me, someone she smiled at every day, someone she comforted when I was scared about my injuries, then how can I trust any doctor or nurse again? How can I trust anyone? Dr. Chen had treated combat veterans with severe PTSD, but the psychological profile of Project Nightingale victims presented unique challenges. These soldiers weren't dealing with battlefield trauma, they were coping with systematic betrayal by their own military family. The very people who should have represented safety and healing had instead become sources of additional trauma. The medical evaluation of affected soldiers revealed the horrifying scope of unauthorized experiments. Blood tests and medical imaging studies showed evidence of at least 17 different experimental compounds that had been administered to patients without their knowledge or consent. Some soldiers were subjects in multiple experiments simultaneously, creating dangerous drug interactions that legitimate clinical trials would never permit. Private First Class David Kim remained in a medically induced coma while specialists worked to reverse the effects of an experimental cardiac stimulant that had caused massive heart failure. His parents, immigrants from South Korea who had been so proud of their son's military service, maintained a bedside vigil while struggling to comprehend how American military medicine could have failed their child so completely. David joined the army to serve his adopted country. He was injured fighting for America, and we trusted American doctors to heal him. Instead, they used him like a laboratory animal. This is not the America we believed in when we came here seeking freedom and opportunity. The ripple effects extended far beyond the immediate victims. Soldiers throughout the military medical system were questioning treatments and refusing medications, fearful that they might be unwitting participants in other unauthorized experiments. Trust between patients and medical personnel, the foundation of effective healthcare, had been severely damaged. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Brennan found herself dealing with a crisis of confidence that threatened the entire military medical system. We're seeing soldiers refuse necessary medications because they're afraid of being experimented on. Some are requesting civilian medical care at their own expense, rather than trusting military hospitals. The damage to our medical readiness is potentially catastrophic. The investigation had also revealed troubling connections between Project Nightingale and overseas military medical facilities. Evidence suggested that similar unauthorized experiments had been conducted on soldiers in combat zones, where oversight was even more limited and cover-ups would be easier to maintain. The possibility that wounded soldiers had been subjected to experimental treatments while still in battlefield hospitals added another layer of horror to an already devastating scandal. Marine Corporal Jason Miller's recovery had been complicated by the experimental nerve compound administered by Captain Mitchell. Instead of the promised nerve regeneration, he was experiencing severe pain and muscle weakness that made his prosthetic arm virtually unusable. His physical therapy had been set back months, and his medical team wasn't sure if the damage would ever be reversible. I lost my arm serving my country, Mueller told investigators. I accepted that sacrifice because I believed in our mission. But to have someone in my own military family, someone I trusted completely, use my injury as an opportunity to experiment on me? That's a betrayal I don't know how to process. The families of affected soldiers were organizing support groups and considering legal action against the military, Titan Medical Solutions, and individual conspirators. The potential for massive civil liability was becoming clear as more victims were identified and the full extent of their injuries was documented. Sarah Mitchell's own family was experiencing their own form of trauma. Her teenage daughter, Emily, had to endure classmates discovering that her mother was being called a war criminal in media coverage of the scandal. Her ex-husband was seeking full custody of their children, arguing that Mitchell's criminal behavior made her an unfit parent. "My mom was my hero," Emily told a family counselor. "She served overseas, she helped wounded soldiers, she worked so hard to take care of us after the divorce. Now everyone says she's a monster. I don't know what to believe anymore." The cytological evaluations of the conspirators were revealing complex motivations that went beyond simple greed. Many had entered military medicine with genuine desires to heal and serve, but a combination of financial pressure, moral injury from combat experiences, and skillful manipulation by criminal organizers had gradually corrupted their ethical foundations. Dr. Santos, who was leading the medical response team, found herself questioning fundamental assumptions about military medical culture. She observed that we train our medics and nurses to follow orders and trust authority. Those same qualities that make them effective in combat situations made them vulnerable to exploitation by people like Dr. Webb. The broader implications for military medicine were still being assessed, but early indicators suggested that systemic changes would be necessary to prevent future conspiracies. Enhanced oversight, mandatory reporting systems, and increased transparency in medical research would all be required to restore trust in military healthcare. As the investigation continued to unfold, one thing was becoming clear. The wounds inflicted by Project Nightingale would take far longer to heal than the combat injuries that had brought these soldiers to military hospitals in the first place.
The secure briefing room in the Pentagon's E-Ring had hosted discussions about countless military crises, but the atmosphere during the Project Nightingale briefing was unlike anything the assembled officials had experienced. Secretary of Defense Robert Hayes sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, reviewing classified reports that detailed systematic medical abuse within America's most trusted military institutions. "Gentlemen and ladies," Secretary Hayes began, his voice carrying the weight of command authority earned through decades of military service, "we are facing a crisis that strikes at the very heart of our military's sacred trust with those who serve. The preliminary investigation shows that at least 67 soldiers across 6 facilities were subjected to unauthorized medical experiments by people they trusted with their lives." General Patricia Morrison, the Army Surgeon General, had spent the previous 72 hours in continuous meetings as the scope of Project Nightingale became clear. Her medical background made the violations particularly personal. Every principle of medical ethics and military honor had been systematically violated by personnel under her ultimate authority. "The medical implications are staggering," General Morrison reported. "We have soldiers suffering from drug-induced cardiac problems, neurological damage, psychological trauma, and complications that may be permanent. Our toxicology teams are working around the clock to identify and counteract the effects of 17 different experimental compounds that were administered without proper protocols." The intelligence briefing revealed connections that extended far beyond the initial conspiracy. Dr. Webb's communications, recovered from partially destroyed hard drives, showed contact with foreign pharmaceutical companies and defense contractors from at least 4 countries. The possibility that sensitive medical information about American military personnel had been shared with foreign entities added national security implications to what was already a massive criminal conspiracy. Admiral James Reynolds, head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, addressed the international aspects of the scandal. "We have evidence suggesting that some of the experimental compounds used in Project Nightingale were developed in partnership with European and Asian pharmaceutical companies. Dr. Webb's travel records showed trips to laboratories in Switzerland, South Korea, and the Czech Republic during the operational phase of this conspiracy." The political implications were equally serious. Congressional leaders were demanding immediate hearings, and media coverage was generating public outrage that threatened to undermine confidence in military medical care. Families of deployed soldiers were questioning whether their loved ones would receive proper medical treatment if injured, creating morale problems throughout the armed forces.
Representative Maria Santos, chair of the House Armed Services Subcommittee on Military Personnel, had already announced plans for comprehensive hearings. She stated in a press conference, "These brave men and women volunteered to risk their lives for our country. They should never have to fear that their own military medical system would victimize them when they were most vulnerable. We will get to the bottom of the scandal and ensure it never happens again." The financial audit of Project Nightingale was revealing the conspiracy's true scope. Titan Medical Solutions had received over $340 million in military research contracts over the past 3 years, with much of that funding used to support unauthorized human experiments. The company had used its access to military medical facilities to conduct research that would have cost hundreds of millions of dollars through legitimate clinical trial processes. Colonel Harrison, now leading the military's internal investigation, presented findings that painted a picture of systematic exploitation. Titan Medical Solutions essentially turned our wounded warriors into a private research laboratory. They saved enormous amounts of money by bypassing FDA regulations and ethical oversight while generating data that helped them secure additional military contracts. The corruption extended beyond medical experiments into procurement fraud, billing irregularities, and potential violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Federal prosecutors were coordinating with international law enforcement agencies to investigate Titan's overseas operations and determine if similar experiments had been conducted on military personnel from allied nations. Secretary Hayes made the decision to immediately suspend all research contracts with companies that had connections to Project Nightingale pending completion of the investigation. The decision affected over $2 billion in ongoing research projects, but he considered it necessary to restore integrity to military medical research. "We will not allow profit-driven corporations to exploit our wounded warriors. Every research contract will be reviewed, every protocol will be scrutinized, and every safeguard will be strengthened. The trust of our service members is not negotiable." The international ramifications were still being assessed. Allied military medical commands were reviewing their own relationships with Titan Medical Solutions and associated companies. Early indications suggested that British and Canadian military personnel might have also been subjects of unauthorized experiments during joint operations and medical exchanges. General Morrison was tasked with developing comprehensive reforms to prevent future incidents. The preliminary recommendations included mandatory ethical training for all military medical personnel, independent oversight of research activities, whistleblower protections for medical staff, and enhanced screening of civilian contractors working in military medical facilities. The psychological impact on military medical personnel who had not been involved in the conspiracy was significant. Nurses, doctors, and medics throughout the system were questioning colleagues, reviewing their own practices, and struggling with guilt by association. The esprit de corps that had always characterized military medicine was being severely tested. Major Jennifer Walsh, who had worked alongside Captain Mitchell but had never been approached by conspirators, expressed the feelings of many clean personnel. "I keep wondering what I missed, what signs I should have seen. Sarah was my colleague, my friend. How did she become capable of hurting the soldiers we swore to protect? And how many other people are involved that we haven't identified yet?" The reform process would be extensive and expensive, but Pentagon leadership recognized that nothing less than complete reconstruction of oversight systems would be sufficient to restore trust. The cost of implementing new safeguards would be significant, but the cost of losing military personnel's confidence in their medical system would be catastrophic.
The federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. became the epicenter of what legal experts were calling the most significant military medical prosecution in American history. Lead prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Martinez, had assembled a team of specialists in healthcare fraud, military justice, and organized crime to handle the complex web of charges stemming from Project Nightingale. The grand jury indictments were sweeping in their scope. Dr. Marcus Webb faced 47 counts of aggravated assault, healthcare fraud, conspiracy, and violations of federal laws governing human experimentation. Captain Sarah Mitchell and 12 other military medical personnel were charged under both federal criminal law and the Uniform Code of Military Justice, potentially facing life sentences and complete forfeiture of military benefits.
This case represents a fundamental breach of trust that goes to the heart of military medical care, Martinez announced during a press conference following the indictments. These defendants exploited wounded warriors for financial gain, turning military hospitals into laboratories for illegal human experimentation. We will prosecute this case with the full resources of the federal government. The defense strategies varied significantly among the conspirators. Dr. Webb's high-powered legal team was arguing that Project Nightingale represented legitimate medical research conducted under implied military authority. They claimed that the experimental treatments were consistent with military medicine's history of innovative approaches to combat injuries. Captain Mitchell had chosen a different approach. Her military defense attorney, Lieutenant Colonel David Chen, was building a case around financial duress and psychological manipulation. The defense strategy emphasized Mitchell's previously exemplary military record and the desperate circumstances that made her vulnerable to Dr. Webb's recruitment. Captain Mitchell is not a monster, Lieutenant Colonel Chen argued during pretrial hearings. She is a decorated combat veteran who made terrible decisions under extraordinary pressure. Dr. Webb and his organization specifically targeted military personnel facing financial crises, exploiting their vulnerabilities for criminal purposes. The victim impact statements were devastating in their emotional power. Corporal Jason Mueller, still struggling with complications from experimental nerve treatments, addressed the court during preliminary proceedings. His prosthetic arm remained largely unusable due to drug-induced nerve damage, effectively ending his military career and destroying his dreams of becoming a career Marine. "I trusted Captain Mitchell with my life," Mueller testified, his voice breaking with emotion. "When I was scared, when I was in pain, when I didn't know if I would ever be whole again, she was there to comfort me. I never imagined that she was using my trust to experiment on me like a laboratory animal." The medical evidence presented by prosecutors was overwhelming. Expert witnesses testified about the dangerous nature of the experimental compounds, many of which had caused severe complications in animal studies. The unauthorized human trials had bypassed decades of safety protocols designed to protect research subjects. Dr. Patricia Santos, the military toxicologist who had led the medical response during the raids, provided crucial testimony about the ongoing health impacts on soldiers who had been subjected to unauthorized experiments. "We're dealing with complications that may be permanent," she testified. "Some of these soldiers will require lifelong medical care for conditions that were caused entirely by illegal medical experimentation." The financial investigation revealed the sophisticated money laundering operation that had funded Project Nightingale. Titan Medical Solutions had created a complex network of offshore accounts, shell companies, and fraudulent research grants to hide the flow of money from legitimate military contracts to criminal activities. FBI financial crimes specialist Agent Robert Kim testified about the conspiracy's financial structure. The defendants created what amounted to a criminal enterprise disguised as medical research. They used legitimate military contracts to fund illegal human experimentation while personally enriching themselves through kickbacks and fraudulent billing. The international aspects of the case were complicating prosecution efforts. Several key witnesses were located in foreign countries, and some evidence was being held by international law enforcement agencies. Extradition proceedings were underway for 3 civilian contractors who had fled the United States when the investigation became public. Military prosecutors were simultaneously pursuing court-martial proceedings against uniformed personnel involved in the conspiracy. The military justice system allowed for charges that weren't available in civilian courts, including conduct unbecoming an officer, violation of lawful orders, and bringing discredit to the military service. Colonel James Harrison, now serving as the military's lead prosecutor, was seeking the maximum penalties available under military law. These individuals violated every oath they took as military medical professionals. They betrayed their fellow soldiers, their units, and their country. Military justice demands the harshest possible consequences. The civil litigation was equally complex, with multiple law firms representing affected soldiers and their families in massive tort actions against Titan Medical Solutions, individual conspirators, and potentially the federal government itself. The civil cases were seeking hundreds of millions of dollars in damages for medical expenses, lost earnings, pain and suffering, and punitive damages. Lead civil attorney Michael Rodriguez was coordinating the efforts of dozens of lawyers representing over 60 affected soldiers and their families. These soldiers gave everything for their country, and their country's medical system betrayed them in the most fundamental way possible, Rodriguez argued. The financial compensation can never undo the harm that was done, but it can ensure that the victims receive the lifetime care they deserve. The media coverage was intense and largely unfavorable to the defendants. Military families across the country were expressing outrage that wounded warriors had been victimized by the very people trusted with their care. The scandal was generating calls for comprehensive reform of military medical oversight and contractor relationships. Legal experts predicted that the trials would take years to complete, given the complexity of evidence and the number of defendants involved. The cases were likely to establish important precedents regarding medical experimentation, military justice, and the responsibilities of healthcare providers in military settings. The preliminary hearings alone had generated thousands of pages of testimony and evidence. The full trials were expected to involve hundreds of witnesses, expert testimony from medical professionals around the world, and detailed examination of military medical practices and oversight systems.
The military courtroom at Joint Base Andrews was packed with family members, fellow soldiers, and media representatives as Captain Sarah Mitchell's court-martial began. The proceeding represented more than just criminal prosecution. It was the military's attempt to demonstrate that justice would be served for those who betrayed the sacred trust between medical personnel and wounded warriors. Colonel Jennifer Hayes, serving as the military judge, opened the proceedings with remarks that captured the gravity of the charges. This court-martial addresses allegations that strike at the core of military medical ethics and the honor code that governs our armed forces. The charges before us are serious, and the evidence will be evaluated with the thoroughness that justice demands. Mitchell appeared in dress uniform, her ribbons and decorations a stark reminder of the exemplary service that had preceded her involvement in Project Nightingale. The contrast between her distinguished military record and the charges she faced created a complex emotional dynamic in the courtroom. The prosecution's opening statement, delivered by Colonel Harrison, was methodical and devastating. The evidence will show that Captain Mitchell systematically violated her oath as both a soldier and a medical professional. She transformed from a healer into someone who caused harm for financial gain, betraying soldiers who trusted her with their lives. The defense strategy focused heavily on Mitchell's psychological state and the circumstances that led to her recruitment by Dr. Webb. Defense attorney Lieutenant Colonel Chen painted a picture of a dedicated soldier whose financial desperation had made her vulnerable to sophisticated manipulation. Captain Mitchell's actions were inexcusable, but they were not the actions of a criminal mastermind, Chen argued. She was a victim of Dr. Webb's criminal organization, targeted because of her financial vulnerabilities and gradually corrupted through psychological manipulation and incremental moral compromises. The testimony of affected soldiers was emotionally powerful and legally devastating. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, still dealing with neurological complications from experimental drugs, described the systematic betrayal he had experienced. "I served 3 tours in Afghanistan, survived IED attacks and firefights, and came home believing I was safe in American military hospitals," Torres testified. "Captain Mitchell's betrayal was worse than anything the enemy ever did to me because it came from someone I trusted completely." The medical expert testimony revealed the full scope of harm caused by Project Nightingale. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the military psychiatrist treating affected soldiers, testified about the unique psychological trauma experienced by victims of medical betrayal. These soldiers are dealing with a form of trauma that's particularly difficult to treat. They were victimized by people they trusted during their most vulnerable moments. This has created trust issues that extend far beyond their relationship with medical personnel. It affects their ability to trust anyone in authority positions. Meanwhile, the federal prosecution of Dr. Webb and civilian conspirators was proceeding in parallel. The civilian trial featured more extensive financial evidence and international conspiracy elements, but the core narrative remained the same.
the systematic exploitation of wounded soldiers for profit. Webb's trial revealed the sophisticated nature of his recruitment and management of the conspiracy. Wiretapped conversations played in court showed him discussing soldiers as inventory and experimental treatments as product testing. His lack of empathy for the human cost of his actions was evident in recorded statements. The subjects are responding well to the Phase 2 protocols, Webb was heard saying in one wiretapped conversation. We should be able to move to Phase 3 within 6 weeks, assuming we don't lose too many to adverse events. The international investigation was revealing disturbing connections to similar schemes in other countries. Evidence suggested that Titan Medical Solutions had attempted to establish partnerships with military medical facilities in allied nations, potentially exposing foreign military personnel to similar abuse. Interpol had issued alerts regarding 3 Titan executives who had fled to non-extradition countries when the investigation became public. The international nature of the conspiracy was complicating efforts to recover assets and ensure complete justice for all victims. The civil litigation was generating its own dramatic developments. Depositions of Titan Medical Solutions executives were revealing internal communications that showed conscious disregard for patient safety. Company emails discussed adverse reactions and complications as acceptable losses in pursuit of research data. One particularly damning internal memo, written by Titan's chief medical officer, stated, "We need to accept that some subjects will experience serious adverse events. The key is ensuring that complications can be attributed to pre-existing conditions rather than our protocols." The financial recovery efforts were yielding mixed results. While prosecutors had frozen significant assets belonging to the conspirators, much of Titan Medical Solutions' profits had been moved to offshore accounts or invested in assets that were difficult to trace and recover. Victim advocate Sarah Chen was working with affected soldiers and their families to navigate the complex legal and medical challenges they faced. These families are dealing with ongoing medical expenses, lost income from career-ending injuries, and psychological trauma that will require years of treatment, Chen explained. The legal system is trying to provide justice, but the human cost of this betrayal will be felt for decades. The reform efforts within military medicine were accelerating as the trials proceeded. New oversight protocols, enhanced screening of civilian contractors, and strengthened whistleblower protections were being implemented across all military medical facilities. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Brennan, now leading the reform efforts, was working to rebuild trust between medical personnel and patients. We have to acknowledge that our system failed these soldiers. The reforms we're implementing are designed to ensure that this kind of systematic abuse can never happen again. The psychological impact on military medical personnel who had not been involved in the conspiracy was significant, but was being addressed through mandatory ethics training, peer support programs, and enhanced oversight that protected both patients and honest medical providers.
The tension in the federal courthouse was palpable as Judge Margaret Stevens prepared to read the verdict in United States v. Marcus Webb. After 6 weeks of testimony, hundreds of pieces of evidence, and detailed deliberations, the jury had reached unanimous decisions on all 47 counts against the mastermind of Project Nightingale. On the count of conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud, we find the defendant guilty, the jury foreman announced, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. The verdict reading continued for nearly 20 minutes as Dr. Webb was found guilty on every single charge, including aggravated assault, violation of federal research regulations, money laundering, and racketeering. Dr. Webb showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, but his legal team immediately began preparing appeals. The guilty verdicts carried potential sentences totaling over 200 years in federal prison, effectively ensuring that Webb would spend the rest of his life behind bars for his role in systematically victimizing wounded soldiers. Judge Stevens scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, but she addressed the courtroom immediately after the verdicts were read. This case represents one of the most egregious violations of trust and medical ethics in American military history.
The defendants exploited wounded warriors during their most vulnerable moments, turning military hospitals into laboratories for illegal human experimentation. The military court-martial of Captain Mitchell had concluded 2 weeks earlier, with equally decisive results. The military jury had found her guilty of conduct unbecoming an officer, violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and multiple counts of aggravated assault. Her sentence included dismissal from the Army, forfeiture of all pay and benefits, and 15 years in military prison. Mitchell's sentencing hearing had been particularly emotional, with several of her victims providing impact statements that detailed the ongoing consequences of her actions. Corporal Mueller, still struggling with nerve damage from experimental treatments, had addressed Mitchell directly. "You were more than my nurse. I thought of you as family," Mueller had said, his voice breaking. "I trusted you when I was scared and in pain. You betrayed that trust for money, and I will live with the consequences of your greed for the rest of my life." The broader legal reckoning was still unfolding. 17 other military medical personnel had been convicted in related proceedings, receiving sentences ranging from dismissal and prison time to reduction in rank and forfeiture of benefits. The systematic nature of the conspiracy had made leniency impossible, even for those who played supporting roles. The civil litigation was reaching resolution with a massive settlement agreement. Titan Medical Solutions and its insurance carriers had agreed to pay $340 million to affected soldiers and their families. While no amount of money could undo the harm that had been done, the settlement would provide lifetime medical care for victims and financial security for their families. Private First Class David Kim had finally awakened from his medically induced coma, though he faced a long recovery from the cardiac complications caused by experimental drugs. His family's portion of the settlement would ensure that he received the best possible medical care for the rest of his life. David may never fully recover from what they did to him, his father told reporters outside the courthouse, but at least he's alive, and now we know that the people who hurt him will pay for their crimes. The international implications of Project Nightingale were still being addressed. Investigations in allied countries had revealed that Titan Medical Solutions had attempted similar schemes involving British, Canadian, and Australian military personnel. Those investigations had led to additional arrests and diplomatic tensions that would take years to fully resolve. The Pentagon's reform efforts have resulted in the most comprehensive overhaul of military medical oversight in decades. New protocols required independent monitoring of all research activities, enhanced screening of civilian contractors, and mandatory reporting systems designed to detect unauthorized experimentation. Secretary of Defense Hayes had personally visited military medical facilities to meet with personnel and patients as part of an effort to rebuild trust. "We failed these soldiers when we allowed this conspiracy to operate undetected," Hayes acknowledged during a visit to Walter Reed. "The reforms we've implemented will ensure that their sacrifice leads to better protection for future generations of wounded warriors." The psychological healing process was ongoing for both victims and the broader military medical community. Support groups had been established for affected soldiers and their families, while military medical personnel were receiving enhanced ethics training and counseling to address the trauma of discovering that colleagues had betrayed fundamental medical principles. Dr. Patricia Santos, who had led the medical response during the initial raids, was now heading a new Pentagon office focused on medical ethics and oversight. "We've learned that even the most trusted institutions can be corrupted by individuals willing to exploit their authority," she reflected. "The challenge now is maintaining vigilance without destroying the trust and collegiality that make military medicine effective." The media coverage of the trials and their aftermath had generated nationwide discussion about medical ethics, corporate responsibility, and the treatment of military personnel. The scandal had prompted legislative action, with Congress passing new laws strengthening oversight of military medical research and increasing penalties for those who exploit wounded soldiers. The long-term impact on military medicine would be profound. Enhanced oversight and reporting requirements would make future conspiracies more difficult to organize and maintain. The severe sentences imposed on Project Nightingale conspirators would serve as deterrents to anyone considering similar crimes. But perhaps most importantly, the sacrifice and suffering of the victimized soldiers had led to systemic changes that would protect future generations of wounded warriors. Their betrayal by trusted medical personnel had been devastating, but their courage in speaking out and seeking justice had ultimately strengthened the military medical system they had served. The night shift at Walter Reed continued, but it would never be the same. New protocols, enhanced oversight, and the painful lessons learned from Project Nightingale had transformed military medical care. The wounded soldiers who had been betrayed by Captain Mitchell and her conspirators had ensured that future patients would be better protected from those who would exploit their trust and vulnerability.
5 years after the SWAT teams breached Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, the institutional memory of Project Nightingale continued to shape every aspect of military medical care. The new Walter Reed Memorial Garden had been dedicated to the 67 soldiers who had been victimized by the conspiracy, serving as both a reminder of past failures and a commitment to future vigilance. Corporal Jason Merler stood before the memorial wall, his prosthetic arm now functioning properly thanks to corrective surgeries funded by the Titan settlement. The nerve damage caused by Captain Mitchell's experimental treatments had been largely reversed through legitimate medical interventions, though the psychological scars remained. He had become one of the most vocal advocates for military medical reform and victim rights. "I used to hate coming here," Mueller told a group of military medical students during one of his regular speaking engagements. This place represented betrayal, pain, and the destruction of trust. But now I see it differently. The people who hurt us are gone, and the system that failed us has been rebuilt. This memorial reminds us that good can come from even the worst betrayals. Dr. Patricia Santos had transformed the Pentagon's approach to medical oversight during her tenure as Director of Military Medical Ethics and Oversight. The office she created had become a model for other government agencies, implementing proactive monitoring systems that had prevented several potential conspiracies from developing into actual harm. "We learned that prevention is more effective than prosecution," Dr. Santos explained during a medical ethics conference. "The surveillance systems, mandatory reporting protocols, and enhanced screening procedures we implemented have identified and stopped dozens of potential problems before they could harm patients." The technology that emerged from the Project Nightingale investigation had revolutionized medical oversight across all healthcare systems. Real-time monitoring of medication administration, automated alerts for unusual treatment patterns, and blockchain-based medical records had made unauthorized experimentation nearly impossible to conduct without immediate detection. Captain Sarah Mitchell had served her full 15-year sentence in military prison, during which she had earned bachelor's and master's degrees in psychology while participating in research about moral injury and rehabilitation. Her transformation during incarceration had been remarkable, though it couldn't undo the harm she had caused to the soldiers who had trusted her. Upon her release, Mitchell had dedicated herself to victim advocacy and medical ethics education. She worked with veteran support organizations, sharing her story as a cautionary tale about moral compromise and the importance of maintaining ethical standards under pressure. Her speaking engagements were painful, but necessary reminders of how good people could become capable of terrible acts. "I can never undo what I did to those soldiers," Mitchell told a gathering of military medical personnel during one of her presentations. "I violated their trust when they were most vulnerable, and some of them will live with the consequences for the rest of their lives. The only thing I can do now is help ensure that other medical professionals understand how easy it is to lose your moral compass when you're under pressure."
The international ramifications of Project Nightingale had led to comprehensive reforms in military medical cooperation between allied nations. New treaties and agreements established uniform standards for medical research involving military personnel, with mandatory oversight and reporting requirements that prevented the kind of exploitation that Titan Medical Solutions had attempted to establish in multiple countries. Dr. Marcus Webb had died in federal prison 3 years into his sentence, never showing remorse for his role in systematically victimizing wounded soldiers. His death had been unremarkable, a heart attack in his prison cell. But it had provided a sense of closure for many of his victims. The man who had treated soldiers as laboratory subjects had himself become a cautionary example of how the pursuit of profit could corrupt scientific research. The Titan Medical Solutions bankruptcy had been finalized, with all remaining assets distributed to victims and their families. The company's former executives who had fled to non-extradition countries remained fugitives, but their ability to continue harmful research had been eliminated through international law enforcement cooperation and financial sanctions. Private First Class David Kim had made a remarkable recovery from the cardiac complications that had nearly killed him. Now a college graduate working as a veterans counselor, he used his experience to help other military personnel navigate the healthcare system and identify potential red flags that might indicate improper treatment. What happened to me was terrible, but it led to changes that will protect thousands of future soldiers, Kim reflected during an interview marking the 5th anniversary of the raids. If my suffering prevents even one other soldier from being victimized by people they trust, then something positive came from all the pain. The military medical community had emerged stronger from the crisis, with enhanced ethical training, improved oversight systems, and a culture that prioritized patient advocacy above all other considerations. The shame of Project Nightingale had been transformed into a determination to ensure that military medical care represented the highest standards of professional ethics and patient care. The families of affected soldiers had found various paths to healing. Some had become activists and advocates, working to prevent future medical abuse. Others had focused on private healing and moving forward with their lives. All had been forever changed by the betrayal they had experienced, but most had found ways to rebuild trust and hope. The legislative changes prompted by Project Nightingale had strengthened protections for research subjects across all federal healthcare systems. The penalties for medical experimentation without informed consent had been increased dramatically, and whistleblower protections had been enhanced to encourage early reporting of suspicious activities. As night fell over Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, the building that had once housed a criminal conspiracy now represented the gold standard for ethical military medicine. The night shift nurses who walked the halls carried with them the lessons learned from Captain Mitchell's betrayal, committed to ensuring that trust between medical personnel and patients would never again be violated so systematically. The memorial garden remained illuminated throughout the night, its eternal flame serving as a reminder that from the darkest betrayals, the brightest reforms could emerge. The wounded warriors who had been victimized by Project Nightingale had not suffered in vain. Their sacrifice had strengthened the military medical system for all who would come after them. The story of the night shift nurse who had deadly secrets would be remembered not just as a tale of betrayal and corruption, but as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of justice to transform even the most devastating violations of trust into opportunities for positive change. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.